So in this video, I'll take you through a few of the elements that make it necessary for you to understand what is healthy for you in the long run and from the get-go. So based on what we've evolved on. So this is where the anthropology really kicks in, and we'll dig deep into what influences biology and what has made human life possible. Charles Poliquin had a good saying, what works is what has always worked, where you can overlay that to the idea and the concept of health. So what is healthy is what has always been healthy, and that is to say that that is what we've been always doing and have evolved to eat, which is exactly the focus of today's video, Hominid Evolution. So if we are to largely understand the way humans have evolved, then we get a much better idea of what we should be eating in the first place. In the previous video, I mentioned ancestral eating and then thinking ancestral is a good start. However, I want to clarify a few things because it's helpful to go back even further. So let's take a look at this graph for a second. So supposedly the mark of brain growth in hominids came after our ability to use fire or discovery of fire and its implications in cooking. But if you look at this graph, you can clearly see that fire came into the picture quite late and that our brains have been growing at that inflection point for a whole lot longer than the introduction of fire, because we started having the tools and making tools for hunting and started hunting more. The idea is that as the climate changed, as it naturally does, it pushed our early hominid ancestors to eat more animals because of the way when the climate changes, the fauna changes, which means like the plants and everything that they were eating, and that they had to resort to different types of foods in their environment. Now, if you look at why this brain increase has exploded from hunting, it will start making sense, which leads us to the first thing that is important to know, which is called the expensive tissue hypothesis. The expensive tissue hypothesis basically puts forth that for 2% of the mass of our body weight-ish, that is our brain, it takes up 20-ish% of our resources and energy, right? So if we look at that pound for pound, it's one of the most metabolic tissues in the body. So that also means that if we have a higher metabolic need, we need to eat things that are higher in nutrient density. So the highest nutrient in its density and caloric content is fat. And this isn't really just about fat, it's also about minerals and vitamins that we need in order for the brain to grow. So both fat and all those minerals and vitamins are major contributors to brain health, considering that most of your brain and your nervous system is made out of fat and protein tissue, but this fat is DHA. So DHA is found primarily in animals and fish. We only have a very small ability to convert plant matter into DHA. So these earlier hominids were probably better suited for DHA production from plants. However, primates are still largely the same intelligence over this entire period, so it surely doesn't make them much smarter to be able to use this DHA generation from plants. So especially after all the research done on omega-3s, which is what DHA is made out of, or on cognition and intelligence, it's pretty safe to say that this has been and still is a pretty important factor into brain development and intelligence and why our brains have grown. So we also have a hard time converting fats from plants into omega-3s, which we don't have that issue with when it comes to animal fats. Minerals, vitamins, and fats, they give us the precursors that we need to create neurotransmitters, protein as well. So all of these minerals and vitamins that we need to create neurotransmitters and hormones can be found in those nutrient-dense foods. So a plant mineral and vitamin is very different than that from an animal source, right? So it's interesting that they are called the same even when they're not. The plant variant is a precursor that still needs to be converted in the body into a usable form. Of course, there are genetic factors tied into this. However, most people tend to be poor converters because the gut itself is not structured to be a good converter of this plant minerals and vitamins into bioavailable or usable plant minerals and vitamins. So two illustrations of this is beta-carotene and retinol. which are both actually called vitamin A, even though beta carotene needs to be changed in the body when we eat it from plants into retinol. You don't absorb it. It's rather that it goes through several metabolic pathways in order to be converted into what we use as vitamin A, retinol. The same could be said for folic acid and folate. So folate is the vitamin B9, and folic acid is just a precursor to B9. So it's weird that they would be called the same thing. Well, one is a precursor and one is the available and usable form. So that leads us, if we get more usable, bioavailable forms of these minerals and vitamins, then our tissues grow faster and bigger and are more healthy. As time passed, we started getting adapted to eating animals, which is what you can see here in this picture when we're comparing digestive systems of animals. So our digestive system as a human being or a hominid is very different than that of a herbivore or an exclusive herbivore. So it's important to know that herbivores can convert their plant matter into fatty acids by fermentation in their intestines when it's gone through several stomachs. So we have a very small ability to ferment these foods, plant matter. So it's easier for us to just eat fat instead, seeing that that's what our bacteria thrive on and convert, which are fatty acids. So the bacteria convert the things that we eat into fatty acids. But with our reduced ability to digest plant matter, it wouldn't make sense as our primary food source. We would be much more served to just eat fat that we can then use and absorb. The other factor that we need to consider that is hardly ever mentioned, or it's starting to get a little bit more traction now, is that 99% of pesticides are natural, meaning that these natural pesticides is what we would call antinutrients, and these have evolved because plants didn't have a means to defend themselves. So like anything else in the organic organism world, it wants to survive and it wants to make sure that their species continue to exist, right? And plants don't have claws, they don't have fangs, so they have a different system to ensure survival. And this is then what we typically call anti-nutrients, which is plant defense chemicals. Now, the interesting thing about these plant defense chemicals is that animals know this intuitively, and with the research of Dr. Fred Provanza that he did on goats, they found that they have an innate nutritional wisdom. So they intuitively know what to eat and kind of how much of. So they would only eat certain plants for a certain amount and then start changing the rotation of the plants that they're eating. So Dr. Provanza also came to the conclusion that it's not just goat, but that is basically how it works in all animals. When looking back on traditional diets, they'll all prepare plant matter in various ways that will largely deactivate these plant defense chemicals, these anti-nutrients, and make them safe for consumption, or at least safer. So except for these populations that due to shifts in the environment had little access to animal foods, they had to get the majority of their food source or their food intake from plant matter. So that doesn't necessarily mean you can't eat plants, it's just that we've been led to believe that de facto plants are healthy. Well, if we put everything together in this series, we can see that that's not the case. So a strong gut should be able to handle them when the gut lining is good, when the bacterial colonies and balance is good, and that our immune system is also strong, and all these other systems from the lymphatic system to your antioxidant systems, because that would make us able to handle these anti-nutrient contents. So the thing is that it's not necessary for us to thrive and even improve health to implement plant matter, but there's also a caveat to this, that they are effective as medicine. Again, it's not a case for should you or shouldn't, it's just, okay, what's the state of all of these hallmarks and your gut and all these other things and the bacteria, and how do these different plant foods impact and influence your health? So if we come back to the quote that I started with from Charles Poliquin, with what works is what has always worked, then our hominid ancestral lineage has been hunting and eating animals and seafood, fish, for a few million years. So during the ice ages, right, our ancestors' primary food was large game like mammoth and plenty of seafood, so whatever seafood they could get their hands on. So this study that you can see here is the nitrogen levels done on Northern Europeans, which reflects what people have known about human food sourcing for quite some time. Which is that it was largely based on a large game and the seafood. This doesn't mean that they weren't eating any plants at all. It's just due to the environment that they couldn't get to it and that they know they didn't need it. And then the obvious benefits of having plant food when it came to the bioavailability of the nutrients and minerals, right? The micronutrients, minerals and vitamins, and the biodensity of these things. So the fats, which make it a good source. The point is that animal foods have been unnecessarily demonized, quite often leading to worse health outcomes in people that have been avoiding them. So of course there's a case for the quality of meat or animal that you consume, which is something you want to pay attention to. So referring to Charles Poliquin quote, how can something that we consumed for 1,000,000 years without real issues have become a health hazard? So I think the obvious answer is that it isn't one, right? The meat in and of itself has never been an issue. It's rather what has been done to it and what it's eaten with, and then the general lifestyle that a person that does eat meat has, right? Which is called the healthy user bias. So when we think about, okay, so I do want to have meat in the diet or animal foods, then of course our primary source would be to have properly sourced, meaning local, pasture raised, grass fed, and making sure that none of the factory farming or other practices that have the detrimental effect on the animal's well-being and then our well-being are into play there.